In 1878, a stranger carried a satchel into a tiny Utah town. Inside was proof of a family so evil, their bloodline was a weapon. This wasn't just history, it was a ticking time bomb of lies, murder, and generational cruelty. A traveling merchant named Jacob Hensworth arrived in Cedar Valley, Utah, clutching a battered leather satchel. But inside wasn't money. It wasn't goods. It was a secret so dangerous it could tear apart an entire community. Birth certificates, letters, family records. And hidden within those pages? The truth about the Fairmonts, a family that had fooled the world into believing they were European nobility. For over 30 years, they lived like royalty in disguise. But their real legacy wasn't wealth. It was horror. What Hensworth uncovered in those Utah mountains wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't a curse. It was something far darker, a family breeding cruelty like it was a sacred tradition. 3 generations had passed down a twisted inheritance, manipulation, violence, and emotional coldness so deep it shattered every moral law of society. Their family tree wasn't built on love. It was rooted in blood and silence. The satchel held evidence of disappearances, murders, carefully covered crimes designed to erase anyone who dared to expose them. This wasn't coincidence. It was a method, a system, a terrifying plan. And it all began to unravel because of one seemingly harmless genealogical inquiry. But here's the twist, this wasn't just about who the Fairmonts were. It was about how far they were willing to go to protect their monstrous legacy. Every document Hensworth carried was a piece of dynamite aimed at a dynasty of evil. Cedar Valley, 1878. A quiet farming town with just 400 souls. Mormon pioneers had built it with sweat and faith, tucked between towering sandstone cliffs and the endless desert. On the surface, it was peaceful. Wheat fields thrived. Cattle roamed. Families prayed together at the church. But under that surface, lurking in shadows, was a bloodline hiding in plain sight. And once Hensworth opened that satchel, there was no turning back. Because the Fairmount secret wasn't just about the past. It was about how darkness can be passed down like an inheritance, and how one family nearly rewrote history by making cruelty their heirloom. The Fairmonts didn't just own land, they owned the town's soul. The family's estate wasn't just property. It was a fortress of power. Over 3,000 acres of fertile valley soil stretched under their control, crowned by a sandstone mansion perched on a hill, staring down at Cedar Valley like a king over his subjects. To outsiders, the Fairmount estate looked like paradise, but inside those walls, a far darker legacy was brewing. With manicured gardens, white picket fences, and imported fruit trees, the property screamed refinement and untouchable wealth, luxuries unheard of in a rugged frontier settlement. At the helm was Augustus Fairmont, a silver-haired patriarch in his early 60s. Always immaculately groomed, he carried himself with the cold dignity of European aristocracy. He swore his bloodline descended from noble English roots, a claim he proved with crests, imported furniture, and genealogical records stretching back to the 1600s. But what if those family records, the ones that made them royalty, were nothing more than a carefully crafted lie? Augustus first arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 with his beautiful young wife, Lelanina, and their infant son Theodore. Wealth in hand, they immediately secured the largest land tract in the valley, establishing themselves as the undisputed elite. Augustus quickly became a local power broker, serving as a counselor to the Mormon bishop and shaping the town's future with an iron grip. Lelanina, admired for her elegance and charity, cemented the family's spotless image with dazzling social gatherings that made the Fairmonts untouchable. Behind every handshake, every sermon, every act of charity, there was a family constructing the perfect mask. The Fairmont children embodied that mask. Theodore, now 31, carried his father's commanding presence, running the estate like a dynasty in the making. Marcus, 28, had razor-sharp negotiation skills, securing contracts that made the family's cattle business unstoppable. Their sister Isabel, 26, was the crown jewel of the valley, married into a wealthy Salt Lake merchant family, locking the Fairmonts deeper into Utah's social elite. Generations weren't just surviving, they were being molded, shaped like weapons for the family's legacy. The third generation carried the torch. Theodore's children, Augustus Jr. and Victoria, both 17, along with Marcus' son Edgar, 15, weren't just smart, they were leaders, admired by peers, and positioned to extend the dynasty. To the community, they looked like the future of Cedar Valley. But in reality, they were the heirs to something terrifying. Because beneath the surface of wealth, nobility, and influence, the Fairmont family was hiding a secret that no picket fence or polished reputation could bury. The Fairmonts were more than wealthy, they were untouchable. Generation after generation carried the same traits: sharp intelligence, magnetic charisma, and a quiet dominance that inspired respect and fear. While other pioneer families buried infants, lost harvests, and bent under the weight of frontier misery, the Fairmonts lived as though tragedy itself refused to touch them. Their children were strong, their ventures always profitable, their friendships free from the feuds and rivalries that tore neighbors apart. But it wasn't just luck. Whenever disputes arose, over land, over water, over business, the Fairmonts always won. And when they won, their enemies crumbled. Failed crops, sudden illness, financial ruin, rivals never stood a chance, and whispers of misfortune followed anyone who crossed them. The people of Cedar Valley never questioned it. They spoke of superior breeding, noble blood, natural intelligence, never daring to see the possibility of calculation lurking behind the perfection. To them, the Fairmonts weren't just leaders, they were destiny itself. Their reach stretched far beyond the sandstone cliffs of the valley. Augustus maintained powerful correspondence across the Western Territories, while his children traveled to Salt Lake City, Denver, even San Francisco, carrying the family's influence wherever they went. And with every connection, Cedar Valley itself grew richer, tying the town's fate even tighter to the Fairmount dynasty. Then, in February 1878, the illusion began to crack. A stranger stepped into the valley carrying a satchel heavy with secrets. His name was Jacob Hensworth, a genealogist from Philadelphia. Hired by a wealthy family in the East to trace their bloodlines, he followed courthouse ledgers and faded records across states, chasing a paper trail that reached back to America's earliest colonies. What he found would rip open the Fairmont legacy, and reveal the monstrous truth hidden inside their blood. A $50,000 inheritance, and a name that should never have appeared. That's what dragged Jacob Hensworth, Philadelphia genealogist, truth hunter, and accidental detective, straight into the heart of Cedar Valley. He had been tracing the bloodlines of a wealthy Pennsylvania estate when the trail twisted into something far more sinister. Among the claimants stood one shocking name, Augustus Fairmont of Cedar Valley, Utah Territory. $50,000 was at stake, but for Hensworth, this wasn't about money anymore. This was about truth. His job was to verify every heir, every paper, every whispered connection. And the Fairmonts? They were about to be exposed. From the moment his carriage rattled into town, Hensworth knew something was wrong. The streets of Cedar Valley were humble, rows of weathered wooden homes, barns, modest storefronts. Yet, looming over them like a kingdom out of place, stood the Fairmont estate. It didn't just tower, it glared down at the valley. White fences, endless fields, sandstone walls, fruit orchards that shouldn't even grow in this soil. To Hensworth, it was like stumbling onto a European manor house teleported into the wilderness. He would later write in his journal, it felt less like America, and more like an old-world fortress in disguise. Inside those walls waited a man who claimed to be nobility, and an empire built on paper. On February 15, 1878, Hensworth walked into the Lion's Den, the study of Augustus Fairmont himself. The room was unlike anything on the frontier. Leather-bound books stretched floor to ceiling. Gilded paintings watched from every wall. And at the center, an ornate mahogany desk where Augustus sat, silver-haired, regal, eyes sharp with centuries of practiced dominance. He welcomed Hensworth with warm smiles, imported brandy, and papers stacked neatly like trophies. To any other man, it would have looked flawless. To a trained researcher like Hensworth, it was the perfect stage, maybe too perfect. At first, everything lined up. Augustus produced a leather portfolio filled with genealogies, family crests, and letters bearing the seals of English parishes. The bloodline seemed airtight, generation after generation of Yorkshire landowners, stretching across oceans and centuries, placing Augustus as the rightful heir to the Pennsylvania fortune. But then, the mask slipped. As Hensworth's fingers traced the parchment, his instincts screamed. Something was wrong. The 18th century documents were printed on paper far too uniform, as though they'd all been created at once. Some signatures appeared copied, their ink strokes unnaturally precise. A seal that should have cracked with age gleamed as though pressed yesterday. This wasn't just genealogy, it was forgery. And not the clumsy kind. This was the work of someone methodical. Someone who had planned for decades to build a fortress of lies, brick by brick. Page by page. Hensworth had walked into the greatest fraud in frontier history, and he was sitting across from the man who built it. The Fairmont papers weren't just forged, they were brilliant forgeries, designed to fool anyone, except Jacob Hensworth. At first, the documents dazzled with their seals, signatures, and crests. But the deeper Jacob looked, the more the cracks appeared. Certain official seals contained spelling errors no government clerk would ever make. Handwriting styles, supposedly spanning a century, bore the same precise flourishes, too similar, as if written by one careful hand. When Jacob raised these details politely, Augustus Fairmont's smile never faltered. His tone remained cultured, refined, but his eyes changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a glint of calculation. It was the look of a man deciding whether a guest was an ally, or a problem to be removed. "Mr. Hensworth," Augustus said smoothly, "surely you understand. Family records are fragile things. Sometimes, preservation requires creativity. The spirit of truth, after all, is far more important than the letter of documentation." That evening, Augustus extended an invitation Jacob could not refuse, to dine with the entire Fairmount family. An invitation that felt less like courtesy, and more like command. The dining room glittered like a palace in the wilderness. Fine china, crystal glasses, servants moving with military precision. Around the table sat Augustus, his wife Elelonina, their sons Theodore and Marcus with their wives, and the next generation of Fairmount heirs. But what struck Jacob wasn't the luxury, it was the way the family looked at each other. Every word spoken seemed to carry two meanings, one for the table and one hidden beneath. Glances flashed like coded messages. When neighbors who had left Cedar Valley were mentioned, or when failed business partners came up, the Fairmont spoke with unsettling detachment, almost clinical, as though ruin and suffering were mere inconveniences. Most unsettling of all were the younger heirs. Augustus Jr. and Victoria, the 17-year-old twins, carried themselves with a poise far beyond their age. Their posture was flawless, their smiles rehearsed. But behind their eyes, Jacob saw something chilling, an intensity, a sharpness, that no ordinary children should possess. It was in that moment Jacob realized, he wasn't just dining with a wealthy frontier family. He was sitting at the table of something far more dangerous. The twins were wrong, too polished, too sharp, too aware. At just 17, Augustus Jr. and Victoria carried themselves with the elegance of seasoned aristocrats. They spoke in measured tones, their words calculated, their gazes too observant. It wasn't the curiosity of youth Jacob saw, it was the cold watchfulness of predators. When Elelonina spoke of the Caldwell family, left destitute after the sudden death of its patriarch, Victoria's reply sliced through the conversation like a blade. "How unfortunate," she said coolly, "that Mr. Caldwell proved so inadequate to the challenges of frontier life." The words were chilling enough. But it was the glance she exchanged with her twin brother that froze Jacob's blood. Later that night, Augustus summoned Hensworth to his study. Behind closed doors, the mask of polished civility slipped. His voice lowered, stripped of charm, replaced with the weight of a man accustomed to power. He spoke of frontier life, of families who failed, of natural selection. And though his words were cloaked in philosophy, Jacob recognized what he was really hearing, a veiled admission that those who opposed the Fairmonts rarely survived unscathed. It wasn't just a warning, it was a demonstration. Augustus swirled his brandy and leaned closer. "Mr. Hensworth," he said evenly, "I trust you'll find our documentation satisfactory. It would be most unfortunate if, technical irregularities were allowed to overshadow the essential truth of our heritage. Surely a man of your intelligence understands, some truths are more important than others. The statement was calm, almost casual, but the threat was unmistakable. Jacob's chest tightened. The man wasn't asking for approval. He was demanding obedience. And in that moment, Jacob realized, the Fairmonts did not persuade. They controlled. When Jacob returned to the boarding house later that night, his unease turned to dread. His satchel had been searched. Papers shifted. A window unlatched that he swore he had secured. Nothing taken, but everything touched. A message left without words. And the next morning, the trap tightened further. Mrs. Patterson, the kindly widow who ran the inn, brought news. An urgent message had arrived during the night. Jacob's elderly mother in Philadelphia had fallen gravely ill, and was calling for him. But Jacob knew, with sudden clarity, this was no coincidence. The Fairmonts were already reaching into his life, hundreds of miles away. The message was a trap, and Jacob knew it the moment he read it. His mother, they claimed, was deathly ill in Philadelphia. But Jacob had received her cheerful letter only days before leaving for Utah. The lie was clumsy in its details, but terrifying in its execution. How had the Fairmonts gathered such information so quickly, twisting truth into weapon? This wasn't a warning. It was a test. A demonstration of how easily they could reach into his private life, bending reality to their will. So Jacob played along. He expressed alarm. He packed his bags. He announced his immediate departure. But while the Fairmonts believed him gone, Jacob instead rode straight to the county seat, where the true records were kept, where the ghosts of history could not be forged with ink and seals. What he found in those dusty ledgers would haunt him until his dying breath. The Fairmonts were never Fairmonts at all. The courthouse documents told another story. A family that arrived in Cedar Valley in 1847 bore the name Fleer. Augustus Fleer had purchased land with suspiciously diverse sources of gold and bank drafts, money that suggested not industry but theft, not legacy but blood. And worse still, their past was stained with death. As Jacob traced the records further eastward, a chilling pattern emerged. In Missouri. In Kansas. Communities that welcomed the Fleers soon learned a darker lesson. Rivals fell mysteriously ill, opponents suffered accidents, and widows sold their land at ruinous prices, always to Augustus Fleer. In Independence, Missouri, a healthy merchant, who had refused to sell his store, was suddenly found dead of a heart attack. Within weeks, the grieving widow sold everything to Fleer for a fraction of its worth. It wasn't coincidence. It was method. A family strategy written in graves. And now, in Cedar Valley, the same story was being rewritten under a new name, Fairmont. Imagine living in a town where every misfortune, every tragedy, every sudden collapse seemed to follow one family's rise. In Lawrence, Kansas, a wealthy landowner died when his horse bucked him off a bridge that locals later discovered had been deliberately weakened. The only ones who gained from his death? The Fleer family. But it didn't stop there. Wherever the Fleers lived, the same pattern emerged. Families who posed even the slightest threat to them, social rivals, wealthy neighbors, or those who knew too much, were struck with wave after wave of perfectly timed disasters. Children would fall ill with strange, unexplained sicknesses. Crops rotted even in perfect weather. Fortunes collapsed overnight after bad advice from trusted associates. And every time, the Fleers benefited, whether by seizing business opportunities, silencing rivals, or eliminating those who dared to stand in their way. It wasn't coincidence. It was precision. Calculated. Cold. Historian James Hensworth traced their trail back to Pennsylvania, where they once lived under a different name, the Fulners. The records painted the same story: business partners ruined, competitors struck with accidents, and families destroyed while the Fulners thrived. But the most chilling revelation came from a retired sheriff, Thomas Brennan, who remembered the Fulners all too well. Meeting Hensworth in a dark Philadelphia tavern, he leaned in and whispered. They weren't just successful. They studied people like predators. They looked at you the way a butcher looks at livestock, measuring, calculating, deciding when to strike. The Fleer family wasn't just ambitious. They were something far darker, something that left ruin in their wake and power in their hands. Do you want me to keep building this narrative in the Mr. Beast thriller style, fast-paced, suspenseful, like a dark true story challenge, or should I continue in the documentary mystery tone? This family didn't just build an empire, they engineered fear itself. They operated with military precision. Every member of the Faulkner family had a role, like soldiers in a war. Their mission? Total control. Nothing happened in their world by accident. From childhood, their kids weren't playing games, they were trained like spies. Their job? To observe, manipulate, and report on other families. Imagine being 8 years old and already groomed to be a weapon in a psychological war. And it didn't stop there. Every business deal was a trap. Partnerships weren't about profit, they were Trojan horses, designed to unlock competitors' secrets and crush them from the inside. But here's the part that will send chills down your spine. Sheriff Brennan, the man who'd seen it all, said the Faulkners didn't even view other humans as equals. He recalled William Faulkner casually calling his neighbors breeding stock. And his son laughed. Because to them, this wasn't a joke. This was reality. For decades, death and disaster followed the Faulkners like shadows. Rivals? Ruined. Neighbors? Gone. And yet, nobody could ever pin murder on them. Why? Because they didn't need to kill. They created the conditions that made people destroy themselves. A businessman would be lured into a risky investment, right before a market collapse the Faulkners already predicted. A political rival would be handed fake evidence, only to embarrass himself publicly and lose everything. A jealous suitor? Pushed into traps that annihilated his reputation. And the Faulkners never got their hands dirty. They just set the stage, watched their targets crumble, and walked away more powerful every time. Brennan's voice shook when he revealed the darkest part. They even did this to their own children. Any sign of kindness, of human empathy, was seen as weakness, something to be burned out. He told one story that left Hemsworth frozen. William Faulkner once forced his 8-year-old son to watch as they slaughtered a horse with a broken leg. Not to teach compassion, but to erase it. To make sure his son learned that mercy was weakness. This wasn't a family anymore. This was a machine. A dynasty built not on love or loyalty, but on cold, calculated domination. And the most terrifying part? Every accident that destroyed their enemies looked completely natural. Imagine being forced to butcher a dying horse, while your father watches to see if you cry. The boy begged for mercy. Tears poured down his face. But his father didn't comfort him, he made him stand there until the tears stopped, and then forced him to help carve the animal apart. This wasn't about survival. It was training. A brutal lesson. In their family, emotion was weakness. But this horrifying scene was just the beginning. In 1843, the entire family vanished from Pennsylvania, gone overnight, just as investigators closed in on their shady business empire. But here's the terrifying part, their disappearance wasn't panic. It was precision. They liquidated every asset in record time, almost like they'd been preparing for the escape for years. Where did they go? Nobody knew. Until Hemsworth's investigation uncovered something shocking. The Faulkners, the Flees, the Fairmonts, were all the same family. They had mastered the art of reinvention, creating flawless new identities wherever they went. Fake genealogies. Forged documents. Entirely new lives. And they didn't just vanish, they upgraded. This was no accident of birth. It wasn't genetics. It was far more disturbing. Generation after generation, the family bred cruelty, manipulation, and exploitation like other families passed down heirlooms. Compassion was erased. Deception was rewarded. Every child was sculpted into a weapon. And the implications? Absolutely terrifying. If the Fairmonts were truly the same bloodline stretching back through decades of lies, then their cozy, 30-year residence in Cedar Valley wasn't a fresh start, it was the crowning jewel of their empire. A psychological war waged against an unsuspecting community. Hemsworth, armed with these revelations, took the ultimate risk. Pretending to have new documents proving their inheritance, he returned to Cedar Valley. But this wasn't about paperwork, this was a trap. His real mission? To expose them. To finally link every false identity back to the monstrous original family. But what he discovered next was worse than anything he had imagined. Because Cedar Valley wasn't just their hiding place. It was their masterpiece. Imagine living in a town where one family controlled everything, your job, your land, even your fate. That was Cedar Valley under the Fairmonts. They ruled not through kindness, but through money, manipulation, and a quiet terror that kept everyone in line. When investigator Hemsworth began digging, he uncovered a chilling truth. Families hadn't just moved away over the past 30 years, they'd fled. Official records claimed they left for better jobs or farming prospects, but the deeper he traced, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't opportunities, these were escapes. Take the Morrisons. Once respected merchants, they vanished in 1865 after their eldest son died in a hunting accident. But witnesses told Hemsworth something far darker. James Morrison had been investigating shady grain shipments tied directly to the Fairmonts. He was about to blow the whistle, until he turned up dead, just days before testifying. Then came the Caldwells. Their patriarch, Robert, once a calm and respected blacksmith, suddenly spiraled into paranoia, raving about neighbors, claiming his livestock was poisoned. The town wrote him off as insane. But when his shop was quietly bought up by Theodore Fairmont for a fraction of its worth, Hemsworth began to see the real game being played. And the Hartwells? They owned the valley's richest farmland, and Samuel Hartwell was the only man brave enough to publicly challenge the Fairmonts. He blocked their attempt to expand grazing rights in 1873, defying their power. 6 months later, his family was cursed by disaster, their prize bull dead of a strange sickness, their well poisoned with chemicals, and then, something unthinkable happened to their teenage daughter. Families weren't leaving Cedar Valley, they were vanishing without a trace. At first, it looked like random tragedies, a sick bull here, contaminated well there, a brutal fall from a horse. But when Hemsworth put the pieces together, the truth was terrifying. Every single family that dared to challenge the Fairmonts ended up ruined. The Hartwells, once the valley's strongest farmers, lost everything. Their prized bull died mysteriously. Their water supply was poisoned. And then, their teenage daughter suffered a catastrophic fall that left her permanently disabled. Within months, the family was broken, forced to sell their land for scraps, leaving Cedar Valley as desperate refugees from the farm they once ruled. And it didn't stop there. Hemsworth uncovered something darker: families who didn't just leave, they disappeared. The Petons, owners of a general store, supposedly moved to California in 1869. But when Hemsworth searched the records, they were gone. No new land deeds, no census entries, nothing. Even worse, their neighbors admitted under careful questioning that the Petons never said goodbye. They simply vanished overnight, leaving behind clothes, furniture, and even family photographs. Then came the Jenkins family. In 1876, they fought the Fairmonts over water rights, and lost everything. The official story? They had moved to Colorado. But their crops rotted in the fields. Their animals wandered free for days. And just like the Petons, no trace of them was ever found in Colorado. Coincidence? Not a chance. Every disappearance, every tragedy, every broken family had one thing in common: they stood in the Fairmonts' way. And just when it seemed the mystery couldn't get any darker, Hemsworth uncovered his biggest breakthrough. He gained access to the private journals of Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling, one of the town's oldest residents, who had lived in Cedar Valley since the very beginning. Now frail and confined to her home, Mrs. Sterling revealed everything she had seen, and what her writings contained would expose a chilling truth about Cedar Valley that no one had dared to say out loud. They didn't just control Cedar Valley, they owned it. The Fairmont family wasn't just powerful. They built a secret surveillance empire inside their own town. Imagine a family so rich and so feared that every argument, every financial struggle, every hidden shame in the community ended up in their hands. Mrs. Sterling, her hands shaking as she flipped through her journals, revealed the truth. They knew everything. Who was cheating, who was broke, even which children had problems at school. Nothing escaped them. But this wasn't just gossip. The Fairmonts weaponized secrets. With one whisper at the right time, they could destroy a reputation, crush a business deal, or bend an entire town council to their will. Then came the darkest revelation. Families who moved away never left at all. Mrs. Sterling leaned closer, her voice cracking. I saw Marcus Fairmont one night, loading something heavy into a wagon with his ranch hands. They rode toward the old canyon mines. Hours later, the wagon came back empty, scrubbed clean. The Pettons didn't move to California. The Jenkins didn't just vanish. They were erased. Her journals mapped a chilling pattern, every disappearance tied to abandoned mine shafts, every rival family silenced the same way. Hemsworth felt his stomach drop. This wasn't corruption anymore. This was mass murder. The Fairmonts weren't businessmen, they were serial killers hiding in plain sight. And they'd been getting away with it for 30 years. They wanted him to know he was being watched. And the message was clear: leave, or be silenced. Hemsworth began to notice signs that his investigation had not gone undetected. His second stay in Cedar Valley had been marked by a series of subtle but unmistakable indications that he was being watched and evaluated. His room at the boarding house was searched more frequently and more obviously, as if the searchers wanted him to know about their activities. His conversations with longtime residents were interrupted by the convenient arrival of Fairmont family members or their associates. Most ominously, the people he had interviewed began to change their stories, claiming they had been mistaken or misremembered details that had seemed clear during their initial conversations. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house operator, approached him on his fourth evening with obvious nervousness. Mr. Hemsworth, she said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. I think it might be best if you concluded your business here soon. There's been talk in town about your research, and not all of it is friendly. Some folks are saying you're stirring up old troubles that are better left buried. That same evening, Hemsworth received an invitation to dine again with the Fairmont family. The invitation was delivered by Augustus Jr., the 17-year-old heir to the family's apparent legacy of sophisticated cruelty. The young man's demeanor during this encounter provided Hemsworth with his first direct glimpse into the way the family's system of psychological conditioning affected their children. Mr. Hemsworth, Augustus Jr. said, his voice carrying the same cultured tone as his grandfather's, but with an underlying coldness that seemed almost inhuman in someone so young. My grandfather is eager to learn about the additional documentation you've discovered. He's particularly interested in understanding how thoroughly you've researched our family's history and what conclusions you've drawn from your investigation. The phrasing of this invitation made it clear that Hemsworth was being summoned for interrogation rather than invited for social conversation. More disturbing was the way Augustus Jr. delivered the message with the confident authority of someone who had never questioned his right to intimidate and manipulate adults, and with the calculating precision of someone who had been trained to extract information through psychological pressure. Hemsworth's dinner with the Fairmont family on February 23, 1878 became a imagine sitting down to dinner, only to realize it's not a meal, it's a trap. Tonight, Hemsworth wasn't just eating with the Fairmont family, he was walking straight into their psychological battlefield. This wasn't a dinner. It was a trial disguised as hospitality. The entire Fairmont clan was there, faces he'd never seen before, all staring him down like judges in a tribunal. From the first bite, the questions started flying. What exactly have you found? How far does your research go? And what do you plan to do with it? Every word was polite, but every question carried one terrifying truth: they knew he'd uncovered something dangerous. And the worst part? This family didn't even need words to communicate. They had their own secret code, glances, gestures, and innocent comments that carried razor-sharp meaning. They weren't talking to Hemsworth, they were coordinating against him. Then came the matriarch. Eleanor Fairmont. She moved with grandmotherly warmth but spoke with icy precision. As she slid dessert across the table, she smiled. Mr. Hensworth, Cedar Valley is a close-knit community. We take care of our own, and we protect our privacy. I'm sure a man like you understands the importance of discretion. It was a thread hidden inside a lullaby. But the biggest shock wasn't the elders, it was the kids. Victoria, just 17, spoke about neighbors like a predator studying prey. Edgar, only 15, talked about leverage and power with the cold logic of a mob boss. That's when Hensworth realized, this wasn't precociousness. This was training. Generations raised to manipulate, intimidate, and dominate. And just when he thought the nightmare meal was over, Augustus stood. The family's voice of authority. Mr. Hensworth, he began, every word dripping with menace, I believe we can reach an arrangement. Your research is impressive. We'll provide you with the documents you need, but in exchange. The room fell silent. Every eye locked onto Hensworth. This wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. Accept their terms, or face the wrath of a dynasty built on control, fear, and secrets buried deep in Cedar Valley. They offered him a fortune to walk away, but when he said no, everything turned into a deadly game. The deal was laid out in front of him, a sleek leather portfolio stuffed with family documents and a massive bank draft. Augustus called it compensation for Hensworth's time and expertise. But the truth was obvious, this wasn't a gift. It was a bribe. A payoff. Take their version of history, pocket the cash, and leave Cedar Valley forever. But Hensworth refused. And that's when the mask came off. The family's smiles didn't vanish completely, but they thinned. Behind their practiced charm, you could see the coldness, ruthless, calculated, and dangerous. Augustus leaned in, his cultured voice steady, but his eyes burned with menace. I'm disappointed, Mr. Hensworth. We hope to resolve this quietly. But understand this, our family has spent generations building its power here. We will not let one man destroy it. Then came Theodore, Augustus's eldest son, and he didn't bother with subtlety. His words hit like a hammer. You're a long way from home. You're stirring up things that don't concern you. Around here, accidents happen. Especially to outsiders who don't know the land. Boom. The threat was clear. And this time, it wasn't just polished words. It was coming from a young man built like a predator, muscles coiled, eyes cold. That's when Hensworth realized the horrifying truth, he wasn't just dealing with liars or manipulators, he was up against a family of trained criminals. Every refusal, every question, every step deeper into the mystery had now placed him in immediate physical danger. And the nightmare escalated that very night. When Hensworth returned to his boarding house, the door hung slightly open. Inside, his room was torn apart. All his research, gone. Every note, every document, every piece of evidence, vanished. The only things left were the papers he'd carried to the dinner. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was war. And with nowhere to run, Hensworth had to make a terrifying choice, back down and disappear, or keep fighting, knowing the Fairmonts were watching his every move. They told him to run for his life, but instead, he went straight into the mines, where he uncovered the Fairmont family's darkest secret. Hensworth stood frozen at the door. Mrs. Sterling's face was pale, her voice trembling. Several men came with a warrant, she whispered. They said you wanted for fraud and document theft. Their papers looked official, and Mr. Hensworth, you need to leave Cedar Valley immediately. These people aren't just powerful, they are dangerous. In that chilling moment, Hensworth realized the horrifying truth, the Fairmonts had forged the law itself. They didn't just want him gone, they wanted his evidence destroyed. Without those documents, his entire case, every shred of proof about their crimes, would vanish forever. But instead of fleeing, Hensworth made a choice that could only be called insane. He decided to go deeper into the darkness. Mrs. Sterling had once mentioned strange activity near abandoned mine shafts on Fairmount land. If there was proof, real, undeniable proof, it had to be there. So, on the freezing night of February 24, 1878, with nothing but a borrowed set of tools, Hensworth slipped into the canyon behind the estate. The full moon lit his path just enough to see the jagged rocks, but the shadows around him were thick, like the valley itself was warning him to turn back. At the edge of the canyon, he found them, the old mine shafts from the failed copper rush of the 1860s. The first one looked sealed, buried in rocks. But something about it was wrong: fresh marks, disturbed soil. Someone had been here recently. Heart-pounding, Hensworth pulled the rocks away until the opening gaped wide enough for him to crawl through. And then, it hit him. That smell. It wasn't dust. It wasn't copper. It was death. The stench of decomposing flesh mixed with lime, the unmistakable chemical bite of bodies being deliberately destroyed. Hensworth had just stepped into the Fairmont family's graveyard. When Hensworth lit his lantern and stepped into the darkness, he never expected to uncover a graveyard built by human hands. The air was thick, suffocating, and then he saw it. Bones. Piles of bones. The mine wasn't abandoned, it was a carefully engineered disposal site. At least 12 bodies, he whispered, his voice trembling. And it wasn't random. Each set of remains was arranged with surgical precision, just like every operation the Fairmont family touched. Then came the real gut punch: personal belongings scattered among the corpses. Tiny shoes belonging to the Peton children. A wedding ring Mrs. Jenkins never took off. A pocket watch that everyone in Cedar Valley knew belonged to Samuel Hartwell. Every piece was proof: these weren't just disappearances. They were executions. But just when Hensworth thought it couldn't get worse, it did. He noticed something wedged deep in the mine wall, wrapped in oiled cloth. He pulled it free. A book. Not just any book, a ledger written in Augustus Fairmont's own handwriting. Inside? The truth. Cold. Merciless. Terrifying. It was a kill list stretching back 3 decades, titled with chilling simplicity, "Necessary Eliminations." Each entry documented like an accountant's ledger: name, date, method, and justification. Robert Caldwell, March 15, 1872, slowly poisoned with arsenic after discovering grain contract fraud. The Jenkins family, August 3, 1876, chloroformed and strangled, because they dared hire a lawyer. James Morrison, October 12, 1865, a hunting accident, staged with defective ammunition to protect government contracts. This wasn't chaos. This was business. Murder as a family enterprise. The ledger didn't stop there. More than 30 names filled the pages, each life erased with chilling efficiency. Arsenic. Chloroform. Rigged accidents. Hidden bodies. Every death had been disguised as natural, accidental, or tragic misfortune. The Fairmonts weren't just a family, they were an empire built on blood, lies, and perfect cover-ups. And now, Hensworth held their darkest secret in his trembling hands. But what he didn't realize was that simply reading those pages had just signed his own death warrant. Imagine uncovering proof that a wealthy family had been secretly running a murder business for decades, and then realizing they were coming for you. Hensworth had just discovered the most chilling detail yet: the Fairmonts didn't even see their killings as crimes. They treated them like routine expenses, cold-blooded cost-benefit calculations where human lives were nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. As he photographed page after page of the ledger, names, dates, methods, and justifications, his heart stopped. From outside the mineshaft came voices, and one of them was Augustus Fairmont himself. "The genealogist has proven more resourceful than anticipated," Augustus said calmly. "His refusal to accept our offer makes him a permanent threat. This situation requires immediate resolution." That's when it hit Hensworth: the family knew he was there. And just like the dozens they had eliminated before, they had come to erase him too. Trapped underground with only one exit, facing killers who had perfected their methods for over 30 years, Hensworth had seconds to act. In a move that would decide whether the truth lived or died, he shoved the ledger and his photographs deep into a hidden crevice of the mine. Then, desperation. He bolted for a secondary tunnel, but the passage had collapsed. The sound of falling rocks echoed like a gunshot, giving away his position. Augustus, his sons Theodore and Marcus, and their armed ranch hands stormed in, cornering him inside the narrow shaft. Their footsteps grew louder, their lantern light cutting through the darkness. And then Augustus's voice boomed in the tunnel, cold and confident. "Mr. Hensworth, your dedication is admirable. But your investigation ends here. History will remember your disappearance as nothing more than a tragic accident. Imagine getting trapped in a dark mine with a family of serial killers who treat murder like a business plan, and the only thing standing between you and death is a single unexpected twist." Hensworth was seconds away from becoming their next victim. Augustus Fairmont didn't shout, didn't rage. He calmly described Hensworth's murder like he was discussing a stock report. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a problem to be solved. Theodore chimed in coldly, "We'll stage it as a cave-in. He'll be buried for months, maybe forever. No one will know." Marcus added with chilling precision, "Don't forget the horse. We'll make it look like he left Cedar Valley on his own before the accident." This wasn't their first time. They had rules, protocols, like a corporation running death as a business. And Hensworth? He was just another number in their ledger. But then, everything changed. Out of nowhere, the impossible happened. Mrs. Sterling, elderly, frail, but unbelievably brave, had followed Hensworth into the night. She wasn't alone. She brought with her Sheriff Tom Bradley, straight from the territorial capital, who had been quietly investigating missing persons. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed down the shaft. "Augustus Fairmont. This is Sheriff Bradley. You are under arrest for multiple disappearances. Come out with your hands up, and bring Hensworth alive." For the first time in 30 years, the unshakable Fairmonts panicked. Augustus' icy mask cracked. His calm dissolved into frantic calculation. Escape routes? None. Damage control? Impossible. The mine that had swallowed so many victims had now become their prison. The standoff stretched into nearly an hour of unbearable tension. The killers who had perfected silence were now surrounded by the one thing they feared most, the law. For decades, they buried the truth beneath Cedar Valley. But on this night, buried deep in the same mineshaft they thought was their weapon, the hunters finally became the hunted. A family so evil, they didn't just murder their neighbors, they studied their minds like lab rats. For years, the Fairmonts ruled Cedar Valley through fear, poison, and manipulation. But in 1878, Sheriff Bradley and his deputies launched a raid that would change history forever. Augustus Fairmont tried everything, bribes, threats, even promises of hidden gold, but nothing worked. By dawn on February 25, the entire family was dragged out of their mansion in chains. What came next shocked America. Investigators found a mineshaft filled with human remains, ledgers detailing 3 decades of killings, and a secret lab where the Fairmonts had mastered poisons and chemical tricks to dissolve bodies faster. Inside their mansion? False identities, forged family trees, and evidence of operations stretching across Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Kansas. But the most chilling discovery was hidden in a locked study, psychological files on every single resident of Cedar Valley. These weren't just notes, they were detailed maps of people's fears, secrets, and weaknesses, weaponized for control. The Fairmonts didn't see neighbors. They saw pawns in a game of survival. The trial that followed in Salt Lake City was unlike anything the nation had ever seen. Reporters swarmed from across the country, painting the Fairmonts as a twisted dynasty of killers disguised as nobility. Witnesses described how their conditioning warped generation after generation, turning children into remorseless predators who believed ordinary people existed only to be exploited or erased. This family didn't just kill, they believed it was evolution in action. The courtroom went silent as Augustus Fairmont began to speak. His words were calm, almost boring, but the content made everyone's blood run cold. He claimed the murders weren't crimes, they were natural selection. Decades of systematically eliminating inferior families, all justified by his family's genetic and intellectual superiority. Even the most seasoned court officials and reporters shuddered. We simply recognized realities that others choose to ignore, Augustus explained. Human society rewards the intelligent and ruthless. Those who lack strategic thinking? They become resources for those who excel. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The trial revealed the Fairmont's fraudulent genealogy wasn't merely a scam, it was a masterclass in deception. They forged documents, crafted flawless backstories, and inserted themselves into communities to instantly gain wealth, status, and influence. Every move was calculated, every identity fabricated with chilling precision. Then came Eleanor Fairmont's testimony. The matriarch detailed their horrifying method of raising children. From infancy, every child underwent rigorous training designed to crush empathy, instill manipulation, and teach them that people existed only as tools for power. She spoke with matter-of-fact precision. Children who were too emotional faced controlled exposure to violence and desensitization exercises until they became cold, calculating decision-makers. By adolescence, the Fairmont children didn't just accept their philosophy, they embraced it. And the younger generation? Absolutely terrifying. They answered questions about the families their clan had killed with confusion and logic instead of guilt. Victoria Fairmont, barely 17, stated plainly, "I don't understand the question. They were obstacles to our family's security and prosperity. Removing obstacles is simply rational behavior." Every word, every calm explanation, made the courtroom feel like a horror show disguised as a trial. A family that had turned murder into science, children raised as predators, and decades of cold, strategic brutality, all laid bare. And yet, they seemed to believe they had done nothing wrong. This family's reign of terror ended in a courtroom, but the horror they unleashed would echo forever. The trial reached its jaw-dropping conclusion. Augustus, Eleanor, Theodore, and Marcus Fairmont were convicted on multiple counts: murder, fraud, conspiracy, and sentenced to death by hanging. The younger generation, still minors, received lengthy prison terms with the slim hope of rehabilitation. But even decades later, experts doubted that years of psychological conditioning could ever be fully undone. The Fairmont estate? Seized and sold to compensate the families of their victims. The cursed mine shafts, once burial grounds for their atrocities, were sealed forever. A memorial now stands in Cedar Valley, a chilling reminder of the family that had turned murder into a cold, calculated science. Jacob Hensworth returned to Philadelphia forever changed. The encounter with the Fairmonts had opened his eyes to the terrifying potential for systematic evil hiding in plain sight. He continued his genealogical work, but now, every family tree became a possible clue to deception and hidden crimes. In 1879, he published The Fairmont Deception, exposing America's most dangerous family in shocking detail. It became a bestseller and cemented Hensworth as a pioneer in criminal psychology. His research revealed something no one had fully grasped before: a family could intentionally condition generations to commit cold-blooded crimes, all while maintaining a veneer of respectability. The Fairmont case ignited a national debate: how much of human evil is shaped by genetics, and how much by environment? How could seemingly civilized individuals orchestrate decades of murders without anyone suspecting a thing? The answer lurked in their meticulous planning, ruthless logic, and the horrifying idea that other humans were nothing more than resources to be eliminated. Hensworth's revelations sent shockwaves through both academic circles and the public imagination. They forced everyone to confront a terrifying reality: sometimes, evil doesn't announce itself, it smiles, pretends to belong, and waits patiently for its moment to strike. What if an entire family could be trained to commit decades of cold-blooded murder, and no one ever noticed? The evidence was shocking. The Fairmont's capacity for evil wasn't inherited, it had been carefully cultivated through psychological manipulation, training, and ruthless calculation. But here's the twist: their system might not have been unique. Their sophisticated methods, creating false identities, infiltrating communities, and eliminating threats with surgical precision, hinted at a network of similarly dangerous families lurking across the American frontier. The possibility alone sent shivers through officials and settlers alike. Could there be more families, hiding in remote corners, perfecting their craft while the rest of society slept? The Fairmont case revealed a terrifying truth: isolation and minimal oversight gave predators the freedom to operate with impunity for decades, exploiting trust, social bonds, and economic dependencies. Cedar Valley was the perfect trap, a small, tight-knit community that never questioned the outsiders who promised stability. This story proves just how fragile communities can be when cunning, ruthless people know how to manipulate the rules. The Fairmonts weren't just dangerous, they were masters of social engineering and human deception, and they showed the world how far calculated evil can reach before it's stopped. So here's the question for you: did the Fairmonts really reveal all their secrets, or did some darker horrors die with them in the shadows? How many other families could be running the same twisted operations across the frontier? Drop your theories in the comments because we're about to uncover even more shocking truths. If you want more insane, real-life horror stories, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The American frontier is full of dark secrets, and trust me, we're only scratching the surface. See you in the next video, if you dare.